Welcome everybody to another episode of Silent Fire.
Silent Fire.
The podcast.
We're back.
We are back. Yes, we are back.
Yeah.
And we've had a bit of a hiatus, but we are back. And I am Joshua Hofford. I oversee a ministry called Wind Ministries, and this is
Colin Nicole. I'm the rector of the parish of St. Mary and St. John here in Summerside and St. Eleanor's.
And that means that he oversees two churches.
That's right.
For the Evangelical listeners.
That's right. Yes.
That just confused.
That's for those who might be confused. Yeah.
You know, we're just cross-denominational. He's a pastor of two churches.
Yeah.
You know, that's we're humble.
Anglican churches. I don't know if
we're
we said
humbler
that.
in our language.
That's true. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. We had this discussion over lunch too.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Colin, what's been going on in your neck of the woods?
We have a dog.
That's
going
right.
on. I mean, it's been busy because we went through Christmas, and that for us is like wildly busy, and then New Year's.
And Candlemas too.
And Candlemas.
Right?
That's Christmas goes right till February 2nd.
Right.
So it's like the whole season plus annual meeting time plus just personal life. Then we got a dog, and that's a lot.
All-consuming stuff.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
What about you?
I've been busy. We've just released our first online course
Cool.
with Wind Ministries, doing some different webinars and online events, that kind of stuff. So we've been putting stuff out there and trying to help people encounter the heart of God.
Yeah, right on, man. It's been good, and we're in your basement. It's a good studio.
Yes, that's right.
I get to see it when you do other things, but you've never invited me to record here.
It's in the secret recording closet.
That's right.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have said basement. I should have said studio.
No, we're humble. We're okay with that,
That's
right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
a basement. That's
mortification of the flesh.
Yes, mortification of the flesh. Yes. Then that's why we do a podcast together.
It is Lent.
Because I understand exactly what you're saying.
Lent.
It is Lent. That's right. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so what we wanted to talk about today is kind of things related to the canonization of Scripture. And from kind of the evangelical perspective of what does the canon look like and kind of how do we roughly understand that, and part of what we talk about is really kind of the popular way people think about those things, right? And then trying to understand how we should actually think about those things and where we have some agreement and common ground, and then the Anglican approach to the canonization, and then we'll probably talk a little bit or mention, because neither one of us are experts on it, but the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, what they would look just to kind of juxtapose those three different views when it comes to the canonization. And I personally, I've got just up here on the wall of books,
the library.
I've got a 3-part series on the canonization of Scripture. It's
cool.
very in-depth thing, and I have flipped through it.
This is the level of expertise with which we're approaching
Yes, I've flipped through it. Yeah, so
they're on my shelf.
They are on my shelf, so it looks like I know what I'm talking about.
Well, you probably know more than I do because you flipped through it.
Yeah, because that's right. That's right. Well, and for me, having come, we've talked about this a number of times, that having grown up for you in the Catholic Church, and then obviously being a priest in the Anglican Church, that the familiarity with the patristics is not abnormal in your vocation, right?
A bit more, sure.
Just as you celebrate feast days,
sure, absolutely.
You've heard the stories, you grew up listening to the stories, and things of that nature.
Yep.
And in terms of the evangelical, I came into an awareness of the patristics in a backwards way, I start to become aware of it and go, who are these guys? As opposed to that more liturgical tradition where those stories are baked into a lot of what you do.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until later in my life that I started even coming across what the process of later in life. I'm 40,
right?
So we'll put that in context. What the process of canonization looked like, and I was saying this to Colin before we started recording, is I was in reading through the patristics, I would see these books quoted from some of the authors,
right?
And largely the quotations from the early church fathers are usually in terms of the Old Testament, are usually out of the Psalms and Proverbs.
Sure.
They're much less out of what we would call, and we'll get into this, the apocryphal works. They're usually, because the Psalms and the Proverbs, and then you have other key texts where the patristics would look at, like the prophecy about a prophet coming like Moses, things like that. So, because they're looking through the nuances of what Scripture says about the coming of Jesus, the nature of Jesus, the makeup of the Trinity, that kind of stuff. Right. So there's less focus on these apocryphal works that most of them would have looked at with a level of authority that maybe in the evangelical church we wouldn't look at it that way.
Sure.
But I would see quotes from like a book, it would say from the Wisdom of Solomon. Right. And so I would just think when I was reading that, before I understood, that I was they must just be talking about Proverbs because that's the book that Solomon. And then I remember one time, I think the way it happened is I went to look up the reference and was like,
where is this?
This doesn't make any sense. This verse doesn't exist. What is this? And so that kind of got me into this. What is the apocryphal? What are the apocryphal works? And how has it happened in the evangelical church that we kind of have almost no regard for them, and then understanding the canonization of Scripture, and the and some of the, I think there's a number of misconceptions about, I guess the first topic we can talk about is the general misconceptions about the canonization of Scripture. Yeah. And I find that, and I'm curious from your perspective, that in the evangelical world, unless you search it out, there's really very little understanding of how Scripture was canonized.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say it's not. I mean, even though these texts like the Apocrypha are a bit more common to us, I'd say probably, largely speaking, you're going to encounter much the same thing. Sure. That your average parishioner in the pew in whatever church is probably not going to know.
They don't care about 3rd, 4th century councils and decisions and decrees.
And if I stood up and said, okay, well, our reading today is from First Maccabees or whatever.
Right.
I don't think anyone is going to go, hey, wait a minute, I've never heard of that before.
Right. Is that actually part of the reading? Would you find some of the Apocrypha in the reading?
I don't think it ever appears, and I could be wrong, but I don't think it ever appears traditionally on Sundays in the Eucharistic, like the readings we read with the Eucharist. But in the daily office as a morning and evening prayer, you would find it, and that because that reminds me that there was one time early in my time as an Anglican when I was in university, the chapel I went to had morning prayer, noon prayer, and evening prayer, and I covered someone for morning prayer kind of early in my time. I didn't know anything about the Apocrypha, and like you, I went to look it up. I looked in the book that tells us what readings, and it was like Wisdom of Solomon or something, and I was like, okay, so I don't realize there's an Apocrypha, and I'm like, how many minutes of flipping through being like, this chapter doesn't exist, before finally someone came over and was like, flip to the Apocrypha, and I was like, what is this? Yeah, okay. So I think on the whole, Anglicans are not. It's more of a non thing for a lot of people, probably. Where
no one growing up, no one. I think people would have left the church if you quoted 1st or 2nd Maccabees.
Right.
There's a distinct possibility.
Yeah.
Or if you said this is from the Book of Tobit, right? Or Judith or Edris or is it Esdras?
Esdras, I guess. Yeah.
Whatever. I think people would have gone, this person's gone loony.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Might as well be Scientology or something.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Or the kind of the more conservative evangelical tradition would have said something in a pejorative way. They've gone Catholic.
Right.
It'd be something like that.
Even worse than just being pagan or whatever.
That's right,
yes.
Yeah. And so I've as I studied. A lot of people come up with conspiracy theories. We can thank the Da Vinci Code for that.
Yeah.
Which actually, I read the book and I thought it was an interesting book.
Sure.
I read this book years ago. I thought, wow, this is an interesting book. Was that a big thing for the Anglican Church?
I was an Anglican then.
Or the Catholic Church?
I don't remember.
You were kind of
that might have been.
You were in your in between years.
That was my in between years where I didn't really care.
It was a really contentious. I can't believe Dan Brown would say these things. Right?
I remember the hype, but I don't.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, it was an entertaining book.
Yeah.
But kind of reading into. I guess it's always been. People like to read into the idea that there was this official day where these high-level leaders in the church got together and kind of said, we're going to ignore all this other stuff. Right? So it almost comes across when people think about it. And I don't know if, like I said, I don't know if this happens in the Anglican church, but it definitely happens in the Evangelical church, is when people hear that there was a council where they decided, these are the books, right? Then they go, oh my goodness, that was some shady business.
The secret
right
cabal.
Yeah, exactly. It's a secret cabal, right? And so we can't trust it. And look at they ripped things out and they added things in, and this is all evil. And this it just kind of engenders this deeper and deeper conspiracy. Mm-hmm. And then the whole thing becomes about Rome and all the documents they have hidden in Rome, all that kind of stuff at the Vatican, and they really know the real thing, but they won't let anybody know it.
Of course.
And I
did learn the handshakes before I left the Roman Catholic Church.
Oh, did you?
Oh, yeah, I got to that level.
Yeah.
And then
I didn't know. Are you serious?
No.
Okay, all right. Don't mess with me like that, because I know the Mormons have the handshakes.
Yeah.
I know they do.
No.
Unless you're just not allowed to tell us by.
No comment.
Yeah, did you sign an NDA?
No comment.
I'm not Catholic anymore. I need to sign an NDA.
Right.
And so I just find that people do they kind of naturally get into this conspiracy theory mindset that you had this secret cabal of leaders that told everybody how they're to think.
Mm-hmm. Do they think that way about the Nicene Creed, though?
I
mean, I know it's not a thing.
Okay,
but
you would get in largely anyway in kind of your non-denominational evangelical churches. If you said, what do you think about the Nicene Creed? They would go, huh?
Sure.
That would typically be the response. So, if you talked about early creeds and couched them under the idea of Trinitarian theology, then they'd be okay with that.
Sure. Okay.
Because there's very much so we're preserving Orthodox theology,
from the
Orthodox theology.
So would the issue then primarily be in this context? Is it an issue with the idea of councils deciding things, or is it? It is.
Well, I think it's kind of an inherent disdain for top-down leadership, and and that significant structure of someone telling us how to think and what to think. I think that probably has more to do with it, and just looking through the history of how Scripture came together kind of blows the idea out of the water. Anyway, it's not like in the 4th century they got together and said let's secretly manipulate everybody to think this way.
Right. Yeah.
There was a long-standing tradition, hundreds of years at this point, that were generally affirmed what texts. I mean, you look at it's funny when you look at the early church fathers, they looked at Paul as a significant. You can't find he's a significant authority on how to think about Jesus. Paul is not someone that is kind of like they quote Paul in the same breath that they would quote the Old Testament. They quote even when you get to Clement, like just after they quote the apostles on the same level of authority that they quote the Old Testament with. There's no difference between them.
Sure.
And you don't find, then the other thing is people find out that there's a gospel of Thomas.
Oh, right.
And a gospel of Peter.
New Testament Apocrypha.
Yeah, New Testament Apocrypha. And these say different things, right? And so Peter wrote a gospel. I didn't know that, right?
Yeah.
And then people that want to discredit Orthodox theological tradition will point to those and say, "There's a gospel. Did you know Peter wrote a gospel?"
Right.
I remember people saying this to me when I was really just starting to deeply engage my Christian faith. Well, did you know that there's a gospel by Peter?
Right.
And so any little bit of research, just a couple articles will show you what the gospel of Peter actually is.
Sure.
And then now that I've studied a significant chunk, I guess, in the early church fathers, it's funny that you don't see them quoting the New Testament Apocrypha at all.
No.
They don't look at it and go, "Oh, these stories of teenage Jesus." They're not referring to any of this stuff.
Yeah.
As on any level as authoritative.
And I think with the councils too, it's not, as you're saying, it's not that the councils came up with this. It's that they codified it.
Yes, exactly.
This isn't where it was figured out. It's where it was
Right.
just the rubber stamp went on it.
Right.
And the majority of the church said, this is what we agreed to.
Yes, exactly. These were widely circulated documents at this point. These aren't minor documents that people haven't read or studied significantly, especially when you look at the way the councils are entirely pointing back to the body of literature that is the apostolic. Like they refer to the apostolic tradition over and over and over and over again. And that the apostolic tradition is the writings that are the work of the apostles that have been handed down to us that teach us about who Jesus is and how that dovetails in with the redemptive narrative of Israel, right? That they're referring to something very specific. And there's a fairly well stated agreement. There are certain books that are like, well, maybe this shouldn't be included, maybe this should be included. Some semblance of disagreement among some of the early church guys, even going as far as like someone like Marcion, who said, well, let's remove everything by Paul because Paul was too Jewish, and let's remove the entire Old Testament because the Old Testament tells a story of an angry God, and we'll keep the Gospels, we'll keep John's letters and a couple other ones, and that's actually, and so that was I think Marcion and Tertullian, if I remember right, were contemporaries arguing with each other. I think it was Tertullian who wrote against Marcion. Could have been Origen, but I think it was Tertullian. And so that's where you start getting some argument and really start nailing down in that, because Tertullian's 3rd century. I think he's 3rd century. I think Tertullian's one of the earlier biblical canonized lists that would have been put forward, like Tertullian saying no, and it's in response to Marcion,
right,
because Marcion is saying let's remove all these books, and Tertullian saying no, these ones here, listing them are the ones that we listen to, and it's largely the New Testament canon. Sure. There may be one or two books in disagreement, but nothing that changes nothing that changes theological opinion in any significant way.
And I think in a way, like we just on a completely historical note, we often underestimate the connectedness of this world.
Yes.
Like we kind of think, oh, well, it must have just been they got together in a council and figured this out. But I mean, there was interchange from all these communities. I mean, they were agreed upon on all of it. It's not like they didn't know who or what the heretics were before the councils came about, right? So we can never underestimate, I think, even though we're tempted to, because we look back and we think, well, it was the 2nd century, the 3rd century. They
were
didn't
kind of podunk farmers that didn't know anything,
exactly.
right?
Well, of course they weren't. I mean, they were in communication with each other. They were having conversations. This stuff was being shared between communities,
right?
And they were coming to these agreements about this
it's true.
Stuff. Yeah,
and there's it. If you think about the only proper comparison, the best proper comparison to our modern world today is the Roman Empire, like the closest comparison, and the if you look through. Just in commenting on that, if you look through really kind of the history of the development of the Roman Empire and the I'm going to make up a word, but the smallening of the world.
Sure,
right? Something very much the same happened then, largely because of how Rome built roads and then policed the roads. Right. So in the same way, to the same degree that our modern world in the mid-90s became incredibly connected because of the internet. To the same degree, the modern world at that time, the Roman Empire, became incredibly connected because of the system of roads. It was just as much a culture course-altering event in history. It took a little bit longer for them. Time did tend to move slower. But that interconnectedness was unprecedented before that time. But you could write you could write me a letter, and where in maybe 100 years before the coming of Jesus, it was iffy whether I would get that letter, because you're going through bandits are policing roads, all this kind of stuff. As the Roman Empire spread, the safety of communication increased dramatically, and so now I could send you a letter, and you would get it within a couple of days. Especially from city, if the cities weren't all the way one side of the Roman Empire to the other. But communication was not it had shortened the length significantly, much the same way, the same kind of dramatic impact that email and texting and all of that has had here. To the same degree in terms of shifting the culture and the way people communicated, it definitely had a similar effect.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Paul's epistles are epistles. I mean, they're things he mailed to people, right? Or sent along with people that were getting there in good time.
Yeah. And that's you get Tertullian, Origen, these guys arguing back and forth with these other pagan authors. Praxis is another one. Marcion, of course, like I've said. What's the guy's name? I can't think of his name. He's starts with a C, but anyway. There's a number of these interchanges back and forth. And then you get into, say, we'll get even a little bit further, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Ephesus, and then moving into the Council of Chalcedon. You've got Cyril of Alexandria arguing back and forth with Nestorius. Right. And these guys, they're writing significant works back and forth. One guy writes a thing and sends it, and then the other guy responds. Yep. This type of communication was very common. And so all of this, so there's no insidious way that this stuff crept up on anybody, right? It's widely publicized, and the arguments, I mean, it's so much so that when Cyril and Nestorius get down to we're going to have a council now, and we're going to decide who's right. I mean, the bishops are called from everywhere because they all know what's going on.
Sure.
And Cyril, the negative way of looking at Cyril is Cyril basically played a political popularity game, and he calls the Council of Ephesus and does it before any of Nestorius's supporters have shown up. And then all of his guys vote to anathematize Nestorius.
Right. Good.
Yeah. And then Nestorius says, "I'm not even coming to your meeting." and really, with between Cyril and Nestorius, the classic Nestorianism, of course, is essentially adoptionism, which should be roundly condemned. But Nestorius probably didn't really teach what Cyril was responding to.
Sure.
Not to the same degree Cyril. They kind of went like this with their language. And Cyril, when you read some of his stuff, I just read through his on the unity of Christ. He comes across as a pretty crass person.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's not. He doesn't. He's well thought, and it's a good work, but he doesn't necessarily come across as
some of the criticism of Origen kind of hangs on that interpretation of what he was saying.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah. Well, that's the difference between the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school. Yeah. So, and I think that kind of stuff is when you start learning the breadth of learning and teaching that was happening, and the broad impact that Christianity was having across the Roman Empire. To think that somehow one moment codified the whole thing or codified the whole thing is it's not nearly that simple.
No,
it's way more complicated than that, and it's fascinating.
And like you said, they would have been going there knowing what they're about and what they're doing.
Yeah,
people had a sense of all of this before they hit the meeting. So what about today? Like what we talked about interpretation or your encounter with the Apocrypha in the Evangelical Church growing up, but is it any different today? Like, are people aware of it? Is it an academic study, but it would be kind of anathema to bring it up in a context of any kind of worship or serious, prayer or scriptural reading?
It's kind of, I would say it's a triviality,
right?
For most people,
right?
It would not be brought up in any serious context outside of scholarly study. But in terms of pastoral ministry, preaching, teaching ministry, anything of that nature, there just wouldn't be anything there.
Sure.
And I don't know that anything has significantly shifted since I grew up in terms of how people think about it. I come across people that become aware of it, and they'll pick up the Book of Enoch, and Jude, of course, quotes the Book of Enoch, and just a kind of a throwaway line, but does quote the Book of Enoch. And so they'll look at things like that, and they'll oh my goodness, I never knew this existed. And so I think when that happens, partly because we don't talk about it at all, when people find out about it, they give it way more credence because they think it's been something missing from their education, right?
Sure.
And so that tends to happen, and I have no problem if someone wants to read the Apocrypha. I've read through a fair bit of it. I don't know if I've read every book in the Apocrypha, but pretty close.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, it's informative, and there's stuff in Enoch I would have questions about.
Sure.
That's the 12 angels that he names and the ranking of them all and all that. That's kind of interesting to me. Then seems very distinctly different than other contemporary writings in Scripture.
Right.
And Enoch almost certainly didn't write Enoch 1 and 2. And I think that's in the Apocrypha, right? Enoch 1 and 2. Seems like it's... I don't know. Okay, well, I keep referencing it. I know. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just part of the extra biblical on there. But I've read I found is it Bel and the Dragon? Is that where Daniel encounters Jeremiah or Ezekiel? Is it when he's in the lion's den?
I think Bel and the Dragon is kind of like it's like an addendum to Daniel,
right?
Isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
It's meant to add on to Daniel. But
and interesting. I find it fascinating.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But I understand why it may not be informative towards why the reformers said this isn't really informative to the faith as we are trying to restore it. Thinking of Luther and Calvin and some of that movement to shake free of some of the traditions in the Catholic Church. So I can understand why they would go through and say, well, we shouldn't put it in here. And not to say that they're perfectly right in doing what they did. I respect Luther, but he also didn't. There's certain books he also wanted to remove from the Bible.
Right.
Anyway, so it's still not given any kind of prominence. It wouldn't be part of a scripture reading or anything like that.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, honestly, the way evangelical communication happens in terms of preaching, teaching, that kind of stuff, it's sometimes so scattershot that there wouldn't be any formal way of thinking, how are we reading through the Bible or teaching through this. It has more to do with the and again, my kind of main place of influence or growing up in would be non-denominational. And it's really falls upon the pastor to determine what's going to be taught, how it's going to be taught, and the rhythm of it being taught.
Sure.
So whereas like with the Anglican Church, you have the Book of Common Prayer really leading and guiding how you're going to focus and where you're going to focus your energy and effort. Now you have some latitude as the priest in terms of what you choose and what readings you work on and all of that. But for a pastor of a non-denominational church, that kind of structure just largely tends to not exist. Now, I know pastors that have welcomed in a liturgical calendar and liturgical reading.
Right.
And so but that's their own prerogative then.
Yes.
Right. But even then you probably wouldn't have any of the apocryphal works thrown into there.
Interesting. Yeah. For us, it's
I'm just
going to if we all open our prayer books to page 700.
Yeah, there's a statement in
there is a statement.
The 39 articles, is that what you said?
Articles,
that talk about how the Anglican Church is going to, I thought this was really interesting, how the Anglican Church is going to approach those extra biblical books, and then what it looks at as the
So it's Article 7, and the article is entitled. You'll encounter a range of opinions in the Anglican Communion now about the authority and the importance of the 39 articles as some people will kind of treat it as like, this is what we have to follow. Other people are like, well, it was an opinion in a particular time. But certainly this is, I think, how the Anglican Church has understood herself in the early days of its inception, the English Reformation. These are the kind of things. So Article 7, it's entitled Of the Sufficiency of the Holy Scriptures for Salvation, which is basically in the first part just says that, Holy Scripture
and we can agree with on that one we can. That's a great
Holy
statement.
Scripture containeth all things necessary to salvation, so that whatever is not read therein may not be proved thereby, is not to be required of any man, that it should not be believed that it should not be believed as an article of faith or thought to be requisite or necessary to salvation. So if it's not in the canon of Scripture, It is not necessary for our salvation. It is not an article of faith. So it goes on after that. It lists the canonical books of the Bible. After that, it says, and the other books, which is referring to the Apocrypha, the church doth read for example of life and instruction of manners, but yet doth it not apply them to establish any doctrine. Such are these following, and it lists the Apocrypha. So it treats it in a completely non-canonical way.
Right.
We do not establish any doctrine based on them, yet there is enough in them that could be useful for us to read and to be edified by, to learn from, that they're not sort of completely thrown out. So often what you'll find if you pick up a Bible that has the Apocrypha that's used in an Anglican church, you're going to find the Old Testament, and then you'll have like the Apocrypha and then the New Testament at the end, right? So
is that really common?
Which
for like any parishioner that comes to your church and they bring out their Bible, is their Bible typically going to have the Apocrypha in it?
It depends on what we're using. We use the NRSV in church, and I don't quote.
Well, and that's the one that butchers John 1, right?
Yeah, that's the one that butchers John 1. Did we have an episode on?
We haven't yet. We need to. That's on our list of things to talk about.
It's not my favorite, but it's the kind of bog standard contemporary.
I thought the ESV was the standard for.
No, I wish.
Okay,
it'd be nice. But no. I mean, it used to be King, of course, the authorized version, King James, and then NRSV. The RSV took over, then the NRSV to.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm pretty sure it does have it. Like our Pew Bibles would have the Apocrypha. Kind of thing.
Yeah, that would never, like if my Bible's right over there.
Yeah.
And if you were to pull that one out, there'd be no mention of it. No. It would
reference trash.
Yeah. Yeah. Throw this out. Yeah.
That's right. No, we would have it. But again, if a church is using the NIV or whatever, then you're not gonna find
right.
it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that that's interesting that you guys kind of fall in the gray area.
We do,
which is what
we do with everything.
That's basically how you've described the church.
Yeah.
We're not too far this way. We're not too far this way. The Evangelicals are like, you're evil. The Catholics are like, you guys screwed everything up.
That's right.
And you guys are like, come on,
Can
we get along? Yeah. Let's just take a little bit of both.
Yeah, middle road.
Drink some tea.
Yeah,
calm down.
Exactly.
And we'll talk about this.
That's right. We'll talk about it later. Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of really beautiful lines in here, in some of our foundational documents that ride that line where it's like we don't. I can't remember exactly the phrasing. It's wonderful where it's talking about the Protestant and the Catholic, and it's sort of like we don't go one way too far one way, we don't go the other way, but we find this sort of this happy medium. And of course, I mean everything that the English reformers, and I mean the reformers in general, but the English ones particularly. I mean, they weren't starting something new. I mean, they understood themselves to be going back to the faith of the apostles, really, and that it was the last hundreds of years or 1,000 years that begun to go too far to one side or the other.
Right, of course. Yeah. And so I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah.
What do you guys think? Because like I said, for me growing up, it was just not even mentioned at all, not even in the wheelhouse of anybody's thought whatsoever. And then I think when we were just kind of trying to make sure that we were thinking that in terms of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, it's fairly well part of the canonization.
Sure. And we might have heard it growing up. I might have heard it on a Sunday and just never took note that it was anything different.
Of course.
Yeah.
And we've learned from Colin that the Anglican Church says, yeah,
sure. If it helps, read it. But,
if it helps, read it. Yeah. And so we want you listeners and watchers and subscribers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Send us an email if you're listening to the podcast. You can look us up on Facebook.
Yeah.
And an email they can send it to is info@winministries.ca. And or if you're on YouTube, comment and let us know. What do you think? What's been your history and what have been your thoughts about the canonization of Scripture? Is it this deep, mysterious thing that has been misrepresented to us, and that we all need to re-question whether these books are actually written and inspired, or you have trust in the full authenticity of Scripture? And I love one of the things that one of the guys in your neck of the woods, N.T. Wright, says when it comes to the authority of Scripture and the infallibility. I think when he's commenting on that, is that it's Scripture. He affirms that Scripture is infallible, but it's not infallible in the sense that it will keep you from error.
Right.
It's infallible in the sense that we can trust the revelation contained therein.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think that's a good way of communicating that. I like how he said that.
Yeah.
So what are your take? What are you thinking? Let us know. Comment, and then if you do like the video, and subscribe, all that kind of stuff.
Smash the like button.
Smash the like
or
button.
whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, or whatever. And yeah, let us know your thoughts. And until next time,
we'll see you then.
We'll see you then.